class. Welcome back yet again for another week. This week we are going to be focusing on Greece and civilization in Greece. The textbook chapter also covers information on Near Eastern empires and the early development of dualism and monotheism. You will read about those and answer questions in the quizzes, but the focus for this week is going to be on the rise of Greek civilization, especially the ideas of the polis and the city-state and the different government types that lent themselves to those city-states and are fundamental to our understanding of Western civilization. All of these terms that are posted on Blackboard relate to the focus for the week. For instance, thinking about how the hoplite, the armed soldier in ancient Greece, played a part in the development of government and the rise of the city-state. The polis being the Greek term for the city-state, and the importance in that in Greek identity and cultural unity. You'll actually be reading a short poem by Solon, who was a heavy reformer for Greek democracy, Athenian democracy. And you'll also touch briefly in the textbook on rationalism. In these short presentations in the lectures, we may not have as much time, but it's important to understand how this development of rationalism influenced Greek thought and government from this point forward. And the helot plays an essentially important role in the development of Spartan culture. So in the second set of lectures, we'll be focusing on kind of the differences between Athens and Sparta. So for this week, our objectives are to explain the emergence of the Greek city-state, as well as compare and contrast the different forms that developed in these city-states. So when you think about Greeks or ancient Greece, what do you think of? What contributions have they made to Western civilization? Lots of things probably readily come to mind. The Olympic Games being one, right? Those just ended recently. Great art. The Romans especially thought this. Most of the copies we have actually of Greek art are Roman copies actually, but there's still the Parthenon and many other architectural remains that we'll look at here momentarily. Philosophy, rationalism, Socrates, Plato, all sorts of advances in mathematics, science, and medicine that are then going to be picked up and by both Islams and Arabs and then fed back into Western Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Poetry and theater, as we know it, really stem from ancient Greece. In fact, it was really thought of initially that Western civilization was born from the ancient Greeks. And it's only in looking where the Greeks borrowed some of their culture that historians have begun to look further back in history and also to the east and south in the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, as we talked about last week. But of course, don't forget what the Greeks have provided us in this modern era. Obviously, lots of movies come to mind, most recent being a really bad movie of the second 300, but also great introduction to Greek history. But most of all, and the textbook emphasizes this over and over, one of the fundamental contributions of ancient Greeks to Western civilization as we think of it today is going to be democracy. While the democracy that many Western countries practice today, slightly different than Athenian democracy, the ideas took root from the ancient Greeks. So we'll be talking about that today. As we talked about the rise of the city-state, or cities and civilizations in week 2, Greece emerged a little differently. Many of you said that there were certain components that made up civilization, such as law, order, cooperation between a diverse population, people trying to work together for the betterment of their communities. These ideas still play a role in the Polis, or the rise of the Greek city-state, with some twists that are definitely different from the rise of civilizations in the empires of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Most important is going to be this concept of the citizen. And then the forms of governments that these citizens chose to follow. Oligarchy, which is basically aristocracy or wealthy group of elites, usually families, ruling a city-state. Tyranny, that of one particular person or family ruling a Greek city-state. And while in our modern sense, a tyrant is usually a negative term, did not necessarily always have the negative connotations in ancient Greece society. And then, of course, democracy. Greece city-states developed mostly, though, because of their physical environment. If you look at this map of ancient, archaic Greece, you can see it's made up of a bunch of islands. The rest on the mainland is a very mountainous country, which, if you think about mountains in general, you always think of, right, small little towns that are isolated from one another. It's difficult usually to get around in mountainous countries. You can't necessarily take a camel, say, from one end of the land or territory to the other. Islands, while they would sometimes, as you can see, a variety of sizes, would house also sometimes multiple city-states, and it would not necessarily be one city-state per island. So a lot of diversity and smaller communities in Greece. So again, that idea of civilization having to be densely populated urban areas comes into play because these small communities, maybe not as highly populated as some of the city-states that emerged in Mesopotamia, were still densely populated in one urban location. Also, Greeks formed a unified culture in the type of agriculture and commerce that they practice. Again, if you go back to the map, being an island, a largely island country, meant that they traveled a lot and they traded a lot. Again, with mountainous regions, you would only probably be able to grow so many diverse products before you needed to get different types of products from other societies, other civilization. The Greeks especially traded barley and wine, grapes and olive oil. The sea, of course, offered them great practical long-distance transportation, which, as was brought up last week, that trade is fundamental to the interactions that promote the development of Western civilization, progress in our modern sense. Greece was also plentiful in timber and metal ore. And again, relating back to last week, the idea of metal was fundamental in the competition between city-states in Mesopotamia. At a certain point, Greece decided too that, along with the Phoenicians, as you can tell from this map, that trade and colonization needed to expand. I'm not going to spend too much time on this idea. Just know that this expansion and these colonizations, again, not quite the idea that we have of what took place with, Christopher Columbus, or even in the 19th century imperialism, which we won't talk about in this class, but on a different scales, setting up different trade posts, really helped with that interaction and cultural exchange, especially between Egypt and Greece. And the textbook has a really great image comparison between the Croesus and Egyptian statue. So the textbook also brings in the idea of animals re-entering, human figures and animals re-entering Greek art because of this exchange. What I want to focus on is some of the commonalities before we look at, in the next lecture, some of the differences. One of the commonalities is religion in the Greek city-state. As you can see here, one on the image on the left is a Greek city with the temple at the top, statue usually in the middle, so that there would be a procession that started at the bottom of the city, again, this one being particular for a mountainous area, and moving its way to the top. Religion was a very public force in Greece. You can see from the plan of a temple that it's designed with all of these columns. Why design these types of columns around the outer edge? Because processions would take place around on the outside. Only the priests or priestess were allowed on the inside of the actual temple. Most of the rituals took place on the outside. Greek culture was a very public culture. What you were seen doing was very fundamental to your identity and to your relationship to the community, which is quite different from Egyptian society, for instance, where religion was more an individual act. The idea of citizenship is fundamental to our understanding of the development of Greek city-states. This idea that free males shared governance was common in Greece, but also unique. Again, some of you had brought this up in your discussion posts in week 2, that idea of people working together for their betterment of their civilization. That idea has its roots here in the Greek city-state. Citizenship, therefore, was for the rich as well as the poor. Even in tyrants' societies or tyranny, tyrants would consider the poor and maybe play to their needs or their ideas for support. It was only, though, for the free citizen. Slaves had no rights. Women could become citizens but had no participation whatsoever in political life. What's really interesting about Greek slavery is that as freedom expanded for citizens in Greek society, is that slavery also expanded. But not to think at any rate that it was ever the type of slavery that we think of in 18th century America. One, slavery was not based on race, same as in Mesopotamian and Egyptian societies. It was usually based on war captives or debt slavery. Two, it was a smaller scale. So while the textbook gives the stat of about 1/3 the population was slavery, there were many reasons that owning slaves may not have been cost effective in agriculture, for instance, which is a very seasonal type job. It would not be good to have your slaves working in the gang labor that we see in Southern America in the 18th century and early 19th century. Just not cost effective. And then Greek women had a very unique relationship to the city-state. Again, being afforded some rights as citizens, but not being able to participate in political life. And the textbook outlines in this section really kind of what some women were like. Spartan women had maybe a little bit more freedom than, say, Athenian women. But in general, women were represented by the males in their family, either their fathers or their husbands. They did not have, again, that public political existence. In fact, wealthy Greek women, and especially in Athens, did not really go outside of the home at all. In fact, it was seen if you had a tan that you were then seen as lower class or lower status, because that meant that you worked out in the fields or you went to market. Wealthy Athenian women would have their slaves go to the market for them. So it was a status symbol almost to have fair skin and to not really leave the household. Monogamy was also expected for women. Of course, that age-old double standard that men could have free sexual relations outside of marriage, but not women. And again, this comes back to even Mesopotamian society and civilization and the role of women. And a lot of it has to do with the legitimacy of the heirs or the family members and passing down property. So we'll pause for now. The rise of the Greek city-state, again, unique perhaps because of the geography, but having these shared cultural ideas that definitely developed in difference or in opposition to the empires that built up in Mesopotamian Egypt, but still experiencing some of the cultural exchange between Egypt and Mesopotamia as Greece set up long-distance trade.